Rick, you need to step back and let the grown-ups handle this. Brad Kellerman said it right there in Conference Room C at the Pentagon, in front of Colonel Hughes and 3 other Air Force acquisition officers. I'd been in the middle of explaining the technical specifications for our radar upgrade proposal when Brad walked in 20 minutes late, straightened his tie, and decided to take over my presentation. My name's Rick Thompson. I'm 49, been working defense contracts for 20 years, ever since I got out of the Navy. And that moment right there, watching Brad dismiss me like I was some junior engineer in front of people I'd been working with for nearly a decade, that's when I knew things had to change. But let me back up a bit. I started at Brewster Defense Solutions right after my Navy retirement. 20 years in the service, last 8 doing procurement logistics in places the Pentagon doesn't like to talk about publicly. Tony Brewster hired me himself back then, said he needed someone who understood how government contracts really worked, not just how they looked on paper. Those early years I was everywhere. Trade shows in D.C., meetings at Wright-Patterson, calls at 0500 because someone at Aberdeen needed clarification on technical specs. I learned which procurement officers had been there since the Clinton administration and which ones were rotating through on 18-month assignments. More importantly, I learned who made the real decisions and who just signed the paperwork. My security clearance is TS/SCI, top secret, with sensitive compartmented information access. Took 3 years of background checks to get it. The kind of clearance that can't be transferred or rushed, no matter how much money you throw at the process. Brad doesn't have any clearance at all. Can't even access half the files for the contracts he's supposed to be managing. For 17 years, I worked directly with Tony. Every Monday morning, we'd sit in his office going over pipeline opportunities, contract renewals, relationship maintenance. He understood what it took to keep government clients happy. It's not about the lowest bid, he'd tell me. It's about trust and expertise they can't get anywhere else. Then came the restructuring 2 years ago. Tony said the company was growing, needed fresh blood, modern management techniques. Brad came from commercial real estate, had an MBA from Vanderbilt. Strategic perspective, Tony called it. Someone who can bring business discipline to government work. The thing about Brad is he's never been wrong about anything in his life, at least not in his own mind. First week on the job, he asked me for a breakdown of our government business. I spent 3 days putting together a presentation covering 14 active contracts, 22 potential opportunities, and the relationship map I'd built over 2 decades. He listened for maybe 20 minutes, then asked, "Can't we just streamline this and bid lower to win more?" That should have been my warning. Sarah and I talked about it that night over dinner. She could see I was frustrated, but we've got Katie starting her senior year at James Madison High, already looking at colleges that cost more than my first house. Mike's a freshman, playing junior varsity football, needs new gear every season. Our mortgage has about $285,000 left on it. And with college looming, changing jobs wasn't exactly appealing. "Give him a chance," Sarah said, clearing the dishes. "Maybe he'll learn." Over the next 2 years, I watched Brad take credit for every successful proposal while staying as far away as possible from the actual work that made those successes happen. When Colonel Hughes called with questions about the radar project, she asked for me specifically. When the folks at Huntsville wanted to discuss technical requirements, they scheduled around my availability, not Brad's. But in management meetings, Brad presented everything as his strategic vision coming to fruition. The worst part wasn't the credit stealing. It was watching him convince himself that government contracts were just like commercial real estate deals. He'd interrupt my calls with procurement officers to suggest efficiency improvements. He'd schedule his own meetings during times I'd specifically told him I was managing critical proposal deadlines. Last month, I overheard him telling Tony that the government division was finally running like a real business unit, as if the previous 19 years of steady growth and relationship building had been some kind of amateur operation. But back to that Pentagon meeting. Colonel Hughes had specifically requested this briefing on the ANFPS 132 radar upgrade proposal. It's a $47 million project over 4 years, involves classified technology integration, and requires someone with both the technical background and security clearance to walk through the implementation timeline. I'd been working this proposal for 8 months, knew every specification, every potential problem, every procurement requirement. Brad showed up late because he'd been stuck in traffic coming back from a networking lunch in Georgetown. Walked into the room like he owned the place, apologized to the colonel for the delay, then looked at me and said I could sit down. He'd take it from here. "Actually," Colonel Hughes said, "we specifically asked for Rick to present this. The technical requirements are quite complex. Brad smiled that MBA smile. Ma'am, I appreciate Rick's input, but I think you'll find my strategic overview will be more valuable for your decision-making process. I watched Colonel Hughes' expression change. She's been doing acquisition for 28 years, came up through the Air Force Academy, knows when someone's trying to snow her. Mr. Kellerman, does your security clearance allow you to discuss the classified components of this proposal? Well, no, but the high-level strategic implications. Then Rick needs to continue his presentation. That's when Brad said it, right there in front of everyone. Rick, you need to step back and let the grown-ups handle this. The room went dead quiet. I mean, you could hear the air conditioning. Colonel Hughes looked like someone had just insulted her personally. The other officers were staring at Brad like he'd lost his mind. I kept my voice level. Brad, perhaps we should discuss this outside. No need. I'm sure the Colonel understands that sometimes we have to manage our technical people carefully. Colonel Hughes stood up. Gentlemen, I think we're done here. Rick, please call me directly when you're ready to discuss the actual technical specifications. Without interruption. After they left, Brad tried to spin it like the meeting had gone well, that he'd established the proper chain of command. I just packed up my laptop and walked out. That night, Sarah found me in the garage organizing my tools, which is what I do when I need to think. She sat on my workbench and waited. Bad day. Brad called me a technical person who needs to be managed carefully. In front of Colonel Hughes. Sarah knows Colonel Hughes. We've had her and her husband over for barbecues. Military folks stick together, and Patricia Hughes is as professional as they come. What did she say? She ended the meeting and told me to call her directly. So call her. I did the next morning. Colonel Hughes was direct, like always. Rick, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Does your management understand what's required for this project? What do you mean, ma'am? I mean, does Brad Kellerman understand that this isn't a commercial contract? That we're dealing with classified systems integration, strict timeline requirements, and oversight from people who don't care about his MBA? Because if he doesn't, we need to know now. I thought about how to answer that diplomatically. Colonel Brad brings a different perspective to the business. Rick, we've worked together for 8 years. I'm asking you directly, can he do this job? The honest answer was no. Brad couldn't handle the technical requirements, couldn't get the security clearance, couldn't navigate the procurement bureaucracy, and didn't understand the difference between selling office buildings and managing defense contracts. But saying that felt like betraying my company. I can handle the technical side, ma'am. That's not what I asked. 3 days later, Brad called a division meeting to discuss what he called relationship management optimization. Apparently, he'd decided that our government clients were getting too comfortable with informal communication channels and needed to understand proper corporate structure. Going forward, he announced all client communications will be routed through my office first. We need to ensure consistent messaging and strategic alignment. I raised my hand. Brad, Colonel Hughes specifically requests direct technical discussions. Most of our clients do. Rick, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need to change. These are business relationships, not personal friendships. The client needs to understand who's in charge. That afternoon, I got a call from Greg Walsh. Greg runs Apex Defense Solutions, our biggest competitor in the government space. We'd talked informally at a defense conference 6 months earlier. He'd mentioned they were looking for someone with my background, but I'd brushed it off. 20 years with one company meant something. Rick, I'm going to cut to the chase. We just lost our senior partner to retirement and need someone who can step in immediately. Full partnership track, equity stake, and every government relationship you bring stays yours to manage. No micromanagement, no strategic oversight, no MBA telling you how to do your job. Greg, I appreciate the offer, but 60% salary increase, signing bonus, and your own division. You'd report directly to me, no middle management. I sat in my truck outside the office for 20 minutes after that call, engine running, thinking about Katie's college applications and Mike's football camp and the fact that Brad had just spent an hour explaining to a room full of engineers how he was going to revolutionize relationships that took me 2 decades to build. That night, Sarah and I sat on the back deck after the kids went to bed. I told her about Greg's offer. What do you want to do? I don't know. 20 years, Sarah. That's a lot of history to walk away from. It's also a lot of respect you've earned that Brad doesn't seem to understand. You think I should take it? I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. But I also think Katie's college isn't going to pay for itself. And Mike's going to need help with whatever he decides to do. If Brad doesn't value what you bring, maybe it's time to find someone who does. The decision point came the following Monday. Brad had scheduled a meeting with Tony to discuss optimizing our government division efficiency. He wanted to consolidate all client relationships under his direct management, establish standardized communication protocols, and bring in outside consultants to modernize our approach. I listened to him present this plan for 30 minutes. Tony nodded along, asked a few questions about implementation timelines, seemed generally supportive of Brad's initiative. "Rick," Tony said finally, "what's your take on this?" I looked at Brad, sitting there with his PowerPoint presentation and his consultant recommendations and his complete lack of understanding about what made our government business work. "Tony, can I ask you something? Do you know why Colonel Hughes specifically requests me for technical briefings? Because you're good at your job. It's because over 8 years, I've learned exactly how she likes information presented, what level of detail she needs, which technical issues matter most to her specific programs. When she calls with a question, I know whether she needs a 2-minute answer or a 2-hour briefing. That's not efficiency optimization, Tony. That's relationship management." Brad jumped in. "Rick, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We can systematize those preferences, create standardized response protocols." "Brad," I said, keeping my voice calm, "have you ever briefed a classified technical proposal to a room full of colonels?" "Well, no, but have you ever had to explain to a procurement officer why a timeline slipped and what you're doing to fix it?" "Rick, you're missing the point. Have you ever sat in a secure facility for 8 hours, working through technical specifications with people who can shut down your project with one phone call? I don't need hands-on experience to provide strategic oversight." "Yeah, you do." The room went quiet. Tony looked surprised. Brad looked like I'd just challenged him to a fight. "Rick," Tony said carefully, "maybe we should discuss this privately." "No, let's discuss it right here. Brad wants to optimize our government relationships. I want to know what happens when Colonel Hughes calls with a classified technical question and Brad can't answer it because he doesn't have clearance. I want to know what happens when the Aberdeen project timeline needs adjustment and Brad doesn't understand the technical constraints. I want to know what happens when we're competing against companies that have people like me and we've got consultants with PowerPoint presentations." Brad's face was turning red. "Rick, I think you're having trouble accepting new leadership approaches. I'm having trouble accepting that you think 20 years of specialized experience can be replaced with a business process." That's when Brad said the thing that changed everything. "Rick, let's be honest here. Government contracting isn't rocket science. Anyone with basic business skills can manage these relationships. You're not irreplaceable." The silence stretched for about 10 seconds. Tony was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. Brad was staring at me with that smug expression he got when he thought he'd made a brilliant point. "You're right," I said finally. "Let's find out." I called Greg Walsh from my truck in the parking lot. "Greg, is that offer still open?" "Absolutely. When can you start?" "How about next Monday? Send me your resignation letter by Friday. I'll have the paperwork ready." That night, I typed up my resignation. 2 sentences. Effective immediately. I am resigning from my position at Brewster Defense Solutions. Thank you for the opportunity. I printed it, signed it, and put it in my briefcase. Friday morning, I walked it into Tony's office. He looked up from his computer, saw the letter, and his face went pale. "Rick, what's this about?" "Brad's right, Tony. I'm not irreplaceable, so you won't have any trouble finding someone else to manage the radar contract or the Aberdeen renewal or the Huntsville proposal that's due next month." "Rick, wait, let's talk about this. I've taken a position with Apex Defense Solutions. They seem to think my experience has value. I cleaned out my desk while Brad was at lunch. 20 years of files, contact lists, and relationship notes went into 3 boxes. The contract database stayed on the company server, but the real relationships, the ones built on trust and years of reliable service, those walked out with me." Brad got back as I was loading the last box into my truck. He watched from the parking lot but didn't say anything. I think he was starting to understand that maybe he'd miscalculated. My phone buzzed as I drove to Apex Defense. Text message from Colonel Hughes. "Rick, need to discuss radar project timeline. Please call when convenient." I called her from Greg's office while we were signing paperwork. "Colonel, it's Rick. I should mention that I'm no longer with Brewster Defense." Pause. "I see. Are you still available to discuss the technical requirements?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm now with Apex Defense Solutions." "Rick, I'm going to be direct. Brad Kellerman called me yesterday about taking over the radar project. He doesn't understand the technical specifications, doesn't have the clearance to access half the documentation, and frankly, after our last meeting, I don't have confidence in his ability to manage this contract." "I understand, ma'am. I'm recommending to my superiors that we transfer the contract to Apex Defense with you as the technical lead. Are you prepared to handle that?" I looked at Greg, who was grinning. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." Tony called me at 6 o'clock that evening. I was at home, helping Mike with his algebra homework. Rick, we need to talk. This is bigger than whatever happened between you and Brad. Is it? The radar contract is worth $47 million over 4 years. Colonel Hughes says the deal is off unless you're managing it personally. That's unfortunate. Don't play games with me, Rick. 20 years should count for something. You're right, Tony. 20 years should count for something. But your restructuring put Brad in charge of relationships he didn't build, in a business he's never worked, with clients who don't know him and don't trust him. Brad's got an MBA from Vanderbilt. He understands business. Government contracts aren't business, Tony. They're relationships. They're security clearances that take years to get and can't be transferred. They're technical expertise that comes from actually doing the work. Brad doesn't have clearance to access half the files necessary to manage the radar contract, let alone the technical knowledge to answer Colonel Hughes's questions. We'll get him cleared. We'll bring in consultants. Secret clearance takes 18 months minimum, and that's if it gets approved. Colonel Hughes has worked with me for 8 years. She trusts my judgment on technical specifications and timeline management. She's not going to start over with someone new because Brad has an MBA. Long pause. What do you want, Rick? I want Brad to understand that some people actually aren't replaceable. This is about ego. This is about competence. Brad spent 2 years taking credit for work he didn't do, relationships he didn't build, and expertise he doesn't have. Now he gets to find out what Brewster's government division looks like without the person who actually runs it. I hung up and finished helping Mike with his homework. Sarah came in with coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. Rough conversation? Necessary one. The next morning brought 3 canceled contracts. Aberdeen pulled out of an $18 million testing facility upgrade. Huntsville suspended negotiations on a radar calibration project worth $12 million annually. Wright-Patterson canceled a preliminary discussion about a new project worth potentially $25 million. Each cancellation came with the same message. Primary contractor relationship terminated. Greg called me into his office at 10 o'clock. Rick, I've got to ask, did you know this would happen? I knew that Brad had convinced himself that government contracts were just about having the right paperwork and submitting competitive bids. I knew he didn't understand the relationship component, or the security clearance requirements, or the technical expertise expectations. What I didn't know was how quickly the clients would make their preferences clear. Your old company just lost $77 million in active contracts because one manager told one employee he wasn't irreplaceable. That's one way to look at it. What's the other way? Brad spent 2 years systematically undervaluing the person who built every government relationship Brewster had. He convinced himself that management credentials were more important than technical expertise and client trust. Now he's finding out what those relationships were actually worth. By noon, my phone had 23 missed calls from Brewster numbers. Greg and I were reviewing Apex's current contract portfolio when my personal phone rang. Rick, this is Patricia Hughes. I wanted to call you directly. I stepped into the conference room. Colonel, good to hear from you. I'm calling because Tony Brewster has been trying to reach me for 2 days, and I think there's some confusion about the radar contract situation. What kind of confusion, ma'am? Mr. Brewster seems to think this is a negotiation, that Brewster can somehow maintain the contract with different personnel. I wanted to make it clear that's not the case. I see. Rick, I've been doing defense procurement for 28 years. I've seen contractors come and go, and I've learned that relationships matter more than company names. The radar project involves classified technology integration with timeline requirements that can't accommodate learning curves or personnel transitions. She paused. The technical specifications require someone with your specific background and clearance level. The timeline doesn't allow for training a replacement. And frankly, after 8 years of working together, I'm not interested in starting over with someone who thinks he can manage defense contracts like commercial real estate. I understand, Colonel. Do you? Because I've had calls from Aberdeen and Wright-Patterson today. The consensus is clear. We work with you, or we work with other contractors. Brewster Defense without Rick Thompson isn't Brewster Defense as far as the Department of Defense is concerned. After the call, I sat in the conference room for a few minutes processing what I just heard. It wasn't just about the radar contract. It was about the entire foundation of Brewster's government business. Greg knocked on the door. Everything all right? Colonel Hughes just explained something I'd never fully understood. For 8 years, I thought I was working for Brewster Defense, building relationships that benefited the company. But from the client perspective, the relationship was always with me personally. The company was just the administrative framework. That's not uncommon in government contracting. Technical expertise and security clearances are personal assets. They don't transfer with company letterhead. Brad never understood that. He saw government contracts as company assets that could be managed by anyone with the right business training. And now he's discovering that $77 million in annual contract revenue was never really Brewster's to begin with. It was yours, and you were sharing it with them. My phone buzzed with another call from Tony. I declined it. That afternoon, I learned that Brad had called a company-wide meeting to discuss what he termed temporary market fluctuations in the government sector. According to my former colleague Steve, Brad spent an hour explaining how they'd overcome the current challenges through enhanced business development and strategic partnerships. Steve texted me afterward. He actually said losing the contracts might be a blessing in disguise because government work is too bureaucratic anyway. I showed the text to Greg. Your former boss is about to learn that some blessings come with very expensive price tags. 3 days into my new position at Apex Defense, Greg called me into his office with a proposal that made me understand why Brad's world was about to collapse completely. Rick, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding relationship-based contracts. What if I told you that Apex has been waiting for exactly this opportunity for 2 years? What kind of opportunity? The opportunity to absorb Brewster's entire government client base by hiring the person who built it. Greg pulled out a folder with contract proposals and client assessments. We've been tracking Brewster's government business for years, waiting for the right moment to make a move. They have great relationships but limited capacity. Apex has enormous capacity but limited government relationships. And now we have both. Exactly. Colonel Hughes called me personally yesterday. She wants to fast-track the radar contract with Apex as primary contractor and you as technical lead. She's also recommending us for 3 other projects that were previously going to other firms. The numbers were staggering. Wright-Patterson was offering a contract extension worth $31 million over 6 years. Aberdeen wanted to expand their testing facility project to include Apex's manufacturing capabilities. Huntsville had 2 separate radar projects they wanted to discuss. Greg, this isn't just about hiring me away from Brewster. This is about absorbing their entire government client base. Correct. And it's all possible because one manager thought relationships were interchangeable. That afternoon, I made calls to procurement officers I'd worked with for years. Each conversation followed the same pattern. I'd explain my move to Apex Defense, and they'd immediately want to know about transferring existing contracts and exploring new opportunities. Major Helen Rodriguez from Aberdeen was the most direct. Rick, Brewster's current management seems to think government contracts are just paperwork. We need partners who understand that these projects involve national security considerations and can't be managed like strip mall development. By the end of the week, Apex had received formal requests for proposal on 8 major contracts previously designated for Brewster. The total value exceeded $94 million over the next 5 years. Brad called me directly on Friday afternoon. Rick, this is getting out of hand. Tony's willing to discuss a significant raise and a promotion if you'll consider coming back. I was in Apex's new government contracts office, which Greg had set up specifically for the business we'd acquired from Brewster. What kind of promotion? Director level? Your own department. I'd report to you on government matters. What changed Tony's mind about the value of specialized expertise? Brad's voice was tight. Look, maybe I underestimated some things, but you're destroying a company that gave you 20 years of opportunity. Brad, I'm not destroying anything. I'm working somewhere that understands the difference between management credentials and industry expertise. The board is asking questions, Rick. They want to know how we lost $77 million in contracts in 1 week. What are you telling them? I'm telling them that some employees are vindictive when they don't get their way. I looked out the window at the Potomac River. Are you also telling them that you don't have security clearance for the contracts you're supposed to manage? Or that you've never worked a single government project from start to finish? Or that you told your only qualified government contractor he wasn't irreplaceable? Brad hung up. An hour later, Tony called. Rick, I need you to understand something. Brad's gone. I'm prepared to offer you his position, plus equity, plus a 70% salary increase. Tony, that's generous. But why didn't any of this matter when Brad was convinced I wasn't irreplaceable? Because I trusted his assessment of the situation. And now? Now I know what $77 million in lost contracts feels like. The call that really drove the point home came Monday morning. Greg knocked on my office door with a grin I'd never seen before. Rick, you need to hear this. He put his phone on speaker. Tony's voice filled the room tight with barely controlled panic. Greg, I'm calling to discuss a partnership opportunity between Apex and Brewster Defense. What kind of partnership, Tony? We want to subcontract our government division to Apex. Apex would handle all government contracts, and Brewster would focus on commercial projects. Greg looked at me and raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting proposal. What would that arrangement look like? Apex would take over all existing government contracts and relationships. Brewster would provide administrative support and facility access. Revenue would be split 70-30 in Apex's favor. I leaned forward and spoke into the phone. Hello, Tony. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Rick, I should have known you'd be part of this conversation. Actually, Tony, I am this conversation. Every government relationship you're trying to license to Apex belongs to me personally. The clients made that very clear. Rick, be reasonable. Brewster invested 20 years in your development. And Brad spent 2 years explaining how easily replaceable that investment was. Turns out he was wrong. Greg took over. Tony, here's our counteroffer. Apex Defense will consider acquiring Brewster's government division assets, office space, equipment, and administrative staff for fair market value. All contracts and client relationships stay with Rick and Apex. That would eliminate our entire government division. Yes, I said. Just like Brad eliminated it last week when he told me I wasn't irreplaceable. The board is meeting this afternoon, Rick. They're going to want explanations. Tell them the truth, Tony. Tell them that Brad managed to lose $77 million in annual revenue by dismissing the one person who actually generated it. Tell them that not irreplaceable turned out to be the most expensive phrase in Brewster Defense history. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my new office at Apex Defense when Steve called with news from Brewster. Brad got fired yesterday. Board meeting lasted 8 hours. Tony's taking direct control of what's left of the government division, but there's nothing left to control. What about the other employees? Most of the administrative staff transferred to Apex with the asset acquisition. Engineering is focusing entirely on commercial projects now. About half their previous revenue base, but at least it's stable. And Brad, here's the thing about Brad. Turns out when you tell someone they're not an irreplaceable genius and they decide to test that theory, you better be right. Steve laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Word around town is he can't get interviews. Defense contractors talk to each other, Rick. Everyone knows he's the guy who burned down a $77 million business because he didn't understand how it worked. What's he doing now? Last I heard, he was trying to get back into commercial real estate. But even there, people are asking questions. Why would someone leave a VP position at a defense contractor? Why did Brewster's government division collapse right after he took over? His story keeps changing depending on who's asking. I looked out my office window at the Potomac. The view from the 15th floor was pretty spectacular. Steve, thanks for keeping me informed. Rick, one more thing. Colonel Hughes called Tony directly yesterday. She wanted to make sure he understood that this wasn't personal against Brewster Defense. She said you'd always been professional and that Apex was lucky to have you. That was kind of her. She also said something else. She said Brad's behavior in that Pentagon meeting was conduct unbecoming and that procurement officers across the DoD had been briefed about the situation. Rick, they blacklisted him. Officially. Guy's never working government contracts again. After the call, I sat quietly for a few minutes thinking about how things change. 3 weeks ago, Brad was convinced that MBA credentials and management theory were more valuable than 20 years of relationship building and technical expertise. Now he knows the difference. I started reviewing the radar contract specifications. Colonel Hughes wanted to accelerate the timeline, and we had the resources to deliver ahead of schedule. It felt good to be working with people who understood that some relationships, some expertise, some experience really can't be replaced by a business process or a PowerPoint presentation. Sometimes the most valuable lesson is learning that respect earned through competence and dedication always outlasts the authority that comes from a corner office and an expensive degree. Brad learned that lesson the hard way. As for me, I learned something too. After 20 years of building something valuable, it's okay to take it with you when you go. Katie got into Virginia Tech with a partial scholarship. Mike made varsity football as a sophomore. Sarah and I paid off the mortgage 2 years early. Turns out some people really aren't replaceable after all.